Abraham Lincoln's motivations for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation were multifaceted. At first, his main goal was to preserve the Union. But as the war progressed, he saw the abolition of slavery as both a moral imperative and a strategic move to weaken the South. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln aimed to disrupt the Southern economy, which heavily relied on slavery. Freeing enslaved people in the Confederate States would undermine the South's labor force, making it harder for them to continue fighting. The proclamation also gave the Union Army a moral cause, energizing abolitionists and adding pressure on Confederate states. Moreover, Lincoln understood that freeing enslaved people could also encourage them to fight for the Union. The proclamation allowed African Americans to enlist in the Union Army, which significantly bolstered the Northern forces. Many African American soldiers and sailors fought bravely in the war, and their participation became an important part of the Union's victory. So, while the Emancipation Proclamation was a step toward ending slavery, it was also a military and political maneuver to weaken the Confederacy and strengthen the Union's war effort. To Abraham Lincoln's views on race, which were complex and evolved over time. In his early political career, Lincoln held the view that black people and white people could not live together as equals in the same society. He believed in colonization, meaning he thought freed black people should be sent to other places, like Africa or Central America, to live separately from white Americans. This was a common view among many Americans at the time, even among some abolitionists. However, as the Civil War progressed and he saw the bravery and contribution of African Americans, Lincoln's views on race began to change. He came to believe more firmly in the necessity of ending slavery and eventually supported the idea of black people being integrated into society as free citizens. This shift is evident in his support for the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and his push for the passage of civil rights laws. While Lincoln did express concerns about racial equality in the 19th century context, particularly regarding social integration, he is also recognized for his leadership in ending slavery and taking steps towards securing freedom and rights for African Americans. His views on race were shaped by the time he lived in, and while he did not initially advocate for full social equality, his actions and policies played a critical role in moving the country toward the abolition of slavery. While Susan B. Anthony and other women were indeed important leaders in the fight for women's rights and suffrage, they were not the key figures in the abolition of slavery. The movement to end slavery was primarily led by abolitionists, many of whom were men and women from various backgrounds, including Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison. Abraham Lincoln played a central role in ending slavery in the United States, specifically through the Emancipation Proclamation, which he issued on January 1st, 1863. The proclamation declared all enslaved people in Confederate states to be free, although it did not immediately free slaves in border states loyal to the Union or areas under Union control. However, Lincoln's leadership was pivotal in There's a lot of debate about Abraham Lincoln's views and motivations, and it's true that his stance on slavery evolved over time. Let's break down the key points. 1. The Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's war strategy. It's accurate that the Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, had strategic military goals in addition to moral ones. The proclamation declared enslaved people in the Confederate States forever free, but it did not apply to the border states or southern areas already under Union control. This was because Lincoln's primary goal at the time was preserving the Union. At the start of the Civil War, Lincoln was not initially focused on ending slavery. His main concern was to prevent the secession of southern states and keep the Union intact. However, as the war dragged on, Lincoln saw the abolition of slavery as both a moral necessity and a strategic advantage. By freeing the enslaved in the South, he aimed to weaken the Southern economy and military, both of which relied on slave labor. Additionally, it was intended to discourage foreign powers, like Britain and France, from supporting the Confederacy, as they had already abolished slavery and would be unlikely to side with a nation defending it. Did Lincoln have slaves? No, Lincoln did not own slaves. He grew up in poverty and had no personal ties to slavery. However, like many politicians at the time, his views on race were complicated. Early in his career, Lincoln believed that slavery should not expand into the new territories. but he did not initially advocate for full social or political equality between black and white people. He did, however, consistently speak against the expansion of slavery, and his views on race shifted over time as he witnessed the contributions of African Americans to the Union cause and heard the calls for abolition. Did Lincoln want to free the slaves? While it's true that Lincoln's early goal was not to immediately free all slaves, his stance evolved, especially as the Civil War continued. The Emancipation Proclamation was a pivotal step in that evolution. It was a military strategy designed to weaken the South's economy and make it harder for the Confederacy to continue fighting. But it was also a clear statement against the institution of slavery. Lincoln believed that freeing the slaves was necessary to preserve the Union in the long term and to uphold the nation's founding ideals of liberty and equality. Lincoln's mindset on slavery. It's important to note that while Lincoln did not initially seek full equality between black and white Americans, he came to view slavery as morally wrong and essential to abolish for the survival of the nation. He pushed for the 13th Amendment, which would permanently abolish slavery in the United States. Lincoln's leadership in the passage of this amendment is what ultimately ended slavery in the country, and his views on race continued to evolve during his presidency. In summary, while Lincoln's early motivations were more about preserving the Union and weakening the South's ability to fight, his actions and policies, especially the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, played a crucial role in ending slavery. His views on race were complicated and evolved over time, but he became an important figure in the fight against slavery in America. The Emancipation Proclamation itself, issued in 1863, had been a crucial step in freeing enslaved people in Confederate-held territories. However, it was limited in scope. It applied only to those areas in rebellion and did not affect slavery in the border states or regions already under Union control. The true, permanent abolition of slavery across the entire United States came with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. After Lincoln's death, Congress passed the 13th Amendment in January 1865, and it was ratified on December 6, 1865, after the war ended. This amendment legally abolished slavery in all U.S. states and territories, ensuring that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So although Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took a critical step toward ending slavery, it was the 13th Amendment that provided the definitive legal end to the institution of slavery in the United States. Lincoln's vision of a nation free from slavery became reality, but his assassination just before the war ended left the responsibility for fully implementing these changes to his successor, Andrew Johnson, and the post-war Congress. The struggle for civil rights and full equality for Black Americans, however, was far from over and would continue for generations. Women played an important role in the abolition movement. Many were deeply involved in advocating for the abolition of slavery and were also integral to the broader fight for equality, which later included women's suffrage. Some of these women were abolitionists and played significant roles in both movements, but it was primarily men like Abraham Lincoln and other political leaders who pushed for the passage of the 13th Amendment. Here are a few women who were involved in the abolitionist movement and fought for equality, influencing the passage of the 13th Amendment. 1. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was an escaped enslaved woman who became one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad, helping other enslaved people escape to freedom. Tubman also worked as a spy and scout for the Union Army during the Civil War, using her knowledge of the South to assist in military operations. Her bravery and leadership made her a symbol of the fight for freedom and abolition. Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth, an African-American abolitionist and women's rights activist, is famous for her "Ain't I a Woman" speech, in which she advocated for the rights of both Black people and women. She worked tirelessly to promote the abolition of slavery and was an outspoken advocate for racial and gender equality. Truth's work was pivotal in both the abolition and women's suffrage movements. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a leading figure in the early women's rights movement and one of the organizers of the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. While she was focused on women's rights, she was also a strong abolitionist. Stanton, along with her close ally Susan B. Anthony, worked for the abolition of slavery and saw the two causes, abolition and women's suffrage, as interconnected. Although Stanton became frustrated with the prioritization of black men's suffrage over women's suffrage after the Civil War, her work in the abolitionist movement influenced the broader push for gender equality. Susan B. Anthony, one of the most well-known figures in the women's suffrage movement, was also a strong abolitionist. She worked closely with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and was involved in advocating for the rights of enslaved people. Anthony and Stanton initially focused on abolition, but as the war ended and the 13th Amendment passed, their attention shifted to women's suffrage. Though Anthony was focused on securing voting rights for women, she worked alongside other activists who supported the abolition of slavery. Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker abolitionist and women's rights activist. She helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which marked the beginning of the organized women's suffrage movement. Mott also played a significant role in the abolitionist movement, working alongside other leaders to push for the emancipation of enslaved people. The role of women in the abolition movement. While these women and many others were active in the abolition movement and helped create the momentum that led to the end of slavery, it was primarily political leaders and male abolitionists who pushed for the passage of the 13th Amendment. Still, the suffrage movement was closely linked to the abolition movement. Many women who fought for the abolition of slavery, like those listed above, saw the two struggles as intertwined, fighting for both the freedom of enslaved people and the rights of women. It's worth noting that after the Civil War, there were tensions between the suffragists and the abolitionists, particularly when the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, granting black men the right to vote, but leaving women, including black women, disenfranchised. This shift frustrated many suffragists like Stanton and Anthony, who felt that women's rights should not be left out of the conversation about post-war Reconstruction and equality. In conclusion, while women like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony were instrumental in advocating for the abolition of slavery and played vital roles in the larger fight for equality, it was the collective work of both women and men that helped bring about the passage of the 13th Amendment. Abraham Lincoln did indeed support the idea of sending free African Americans to Africa or other parts of the world, but it was part of a broader and more complex set of beliefs early in his political career. This idea was rooted in his views on colonization, not necessarily in the belief that black people should not be free, but rather that they could not coexist with white people in the same society in the way that many Americans thought at the time. Here's a more detailed explanation. Lincoln and colonization. In the mid-1800s, many Americans, including some prominent abolitionists, believed in the idea of colonization. This idea was based on the belief that black people, both free and enslaved, could not fully integrate into white American society because of deeply ingrained racial prejudices. The idea of colonization proposed that free black people could be sent to colonies outside of the United States to establish new communities, with Africa being a primary destination. One of the key organizations promoting colonization was the American Colonization Society, ACS, which was founded in 1816. It advocated for the relocation of free black people to Liberia, a country in West Africa, where a colony was established by the ACS in the 1820s. Over time, some of Lincoln's early political support for colonization grew from his association with people who believed that black Americans would be better off in Africa, as racial tensions were very high in the U.S. at the time. Lincoln's role. When Lincoln became president, he initially supported colonization as a potential solution to the race problem. He believed that while slavery needed to end, the integration of black people into American society would be difficult due to the racial prejudices of many white Americans. In his early years as president, he explored colonization options and even communicated with black leaders about the possibility of sending free black Americans to Liberia or other places outside the U.S. In August 1862, Lincoln met with a group of prominent African American leaders in the White House, including Frederick Douglass's allies like James Mitchell and Frederick Douglass himself. During this meeting, Lincoln discussed his thoughts on colonization and proposed sending free African Americans to places like Liberia or Haiti. While Lincoln never fully endorsed the idea, he did see it as a potential solution during the early years of his presidency, particularly as he was trying to balance his desire to end slavery with the widely held belief that Black people should not be part of the social and political life of the United States. Shift in Lincoln's views. As the Civil War continued and the fight to preserve the Union grew more urgent, Lincoln's views on slavery and race began to evolve. The American Colonization Society, ACS. The ACS was founded in 1816 by a group of prominent white Americans who were motivated by a combination of abolitionist and racial motivations. The ACS's goal was to send free African Americans, both those who had been freed from slavery and those born free, back to Africa, where they could live without the threat of slavery and discrimination. They believed that African Americans could not integrate into American society due to deeply ingrained racial prejudices. While some supporters of the ACS genuinely believed they were offering a chance at freedom and a better life for African Americans, others were more motivated by the desire to rid the United States of free Black people, whom they thought posed a threat to the social order. Founding of Liberia. In 1820, the ACS established a colony in West Africa that would later become known as Liberia. The first group of emigrants, mostly free Black Americans, arrived in Liberia that year aboard the ship Elizabeth. These early settlers were given land to establish their own communities, and Liberia was initially envisioned as a place where free African Americans could have a fresh start, free from the prejudice and restrictions they faced in the U.S. The colony was named Liberia, which comes from the Latin word liber, meaning free. The idea was to create a safe and independent haven for Black Americans. However, it wasn't only African Americans who were involved in Liberia's creation. Indigenous African groups also lived in the area, and their experiences with the colonists were often tense and conflict-ridden. The role of Liberia in the broader colonization movement. The ACS continued to send settlers to Liberia throughout the 19th century. By 1847, Liberia declared its independence, becoming the first independent republic in Africa. The country's capital, Monrovia, was named after the U.S. President James Monroe, who was a strong supporter of the colonization efforts. Challenges in Liberia. While the ACS's goals of creating a homeland for African Americans in Liberia were noble in some respects, the reality was more complicated. The colonists faced significant challenges in adapting to their new environment. Many of them had little experience with farming and were unfamiliar with the local customs, climate, and geography. Moreover, the relationship between the colonists and the indigenous African people of Liberia was often tense and at times violent. The colonists established a government and economic systems that favored their interests, but the indigenous people had their own traditions and social structures. This led to conflicts over land, resources, and political control. Legacy of Liberia and the ACS. The colonization movement, as promoted by the ACS, was controversial. While it provided a new life for some free Black Americans, it also reflected the racial attitudes of the time, which saw African Americans as incapable of integrating into American society. The colonization of Liberia and the eventual establishment of an independent nation there represents both an effort to provide freedom and self-determination to African Americans and the unfortunate reality of colonialist attitudes that often disregarded the existing populations of Africa. By the time the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, the influence of the ACS had waned. The idea of colonization had largely fallen out of favor as African Americans increasingly fought for full citizenship and equal rights within the United States itself. However, Liberia remained an important symbol of Black autonomy for some in the African American community, and the country continues to have historical ties to the United States. Conclusion. The founding of Liberia by the American Colonization Society in 1820 was part of a broader effort to address the race problem in the United States, though it was rooted in the racial attitudes of the time. While some saw it as an opportunity for freedom and a new start, it was also part of a plan to remove free Black people from the U.S., a perspective that is seen as deeply problematic today. Liberia's eventual independence in 1847 made it a significant chapter in the history of both African Americans and Africa itself. Though the complexities of colonization and race relations in Liberia continue to be a subject of study and debate,